Cuba mourns the death of Fidel Castro, we take a look at the life and legacy of the legendary leader and the impact he had on Latin America. I'm Elaine Reyes in Washington, D.C., and this is a special edition of America's Now. First up, the Cuban Revolution inspired Latin America's social movements for decades.
Será la victoria, patria o muerte.
America's Now remembers the key role of Castro in the region's history and politics, including the invasion of Grenada by the United States, and later what Cubans expect in the future as they say goodbye to the person who changed the destiny of the island 57 years ago. Welcome to the show. From the moment Fidel Castro took over power in Cuba in 1959, he became an inspiration for those against the presence of capitalism in Latin America. Following the lead of Cuba's revolution, several left-wing guerrillas operated in the region. In Uruguay, the Tupamaros, the national liberation movement in the 70s, became a guerrilla group that operated in the streets of the capital. Former President Jose Mujica was part of it. At almost the same time in Argentina, the Montoneros guerrilla group grew. Castro's influence also left his mark on the second presidency of Juan Domingo Perón in 1973. In Colombia, the M19 and the ELN groups declared themselves aligned with Castro's beliefs, and eventually the FARC, which was founded before the Cuban Revolution, also found great commonalities with Fidel Castro's style and philosophy. The influence and even the direct participation of Cuba was very clear in Nicaragua, where the so-called Sandinista revolution brought down the dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza in the 70s. Castro also backed the rise of Salvador Allende in Chile and Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. It triggered alarms in the U.S., which considered the Western Hemisphere region strategic in their war against communism. Eventually, the region saw U.S.-backed military dictatorships in the Southern Cone, in Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina, and Chile. Presidents like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia, and Rafael Correa in Ecuador have pledged allegiance to Castro and his revolution. One of Cuba's recent roles in the region was mediating an agreement in Colombia between the FARC guerrilla group and the government. It was a gesture in favor of peace, but there was a time when Cuba itself was also at the center of the conflict. It happened in Nicaragua, but also in the Caribbean island of Grenada, where Cuban soldiers confronted U.S. troops in 1983. Stephen Gibbs has that story.
Grenada, in many ways a typical laid-back Caribbean hideaway. These days, tourism is what it's famous for. Few of the thousands of visitors that come to relax here will pay much attention to this spectacular island's relatively recent, complicated history. Robert Ross is an exception. Arriving here on vacation, he wasn't sure what to say when immigration asked him if he'd been to Grenada before. He had, but the last time he parachuted in onto the same runway now used by commercial jets.
I actually landed between those big double stripes and the next little smaller stripe.
Robert, a former Army Ranger, took part in the 1983 U.S. invasion here. So what brought Robert and 7,000 U.S. military personnel to this tiny island in the Caribbean? Why did this remote outpost briefly become the focus of the United States, Cuba, and the Cold War?
Long live friendship. friendship, solidarity, and cooperation.
1979, Maurice Bishop, a British-educated lawyer, seized power in Grenada as the leader of a popular leftist uprising. He declares himself Prime Minister while the incumbent is overseas. Rival political parties are soon banned. An eloquent orator, many were struck by his easygoing style.
When if you drive around Grenada, you see the most...
Dr. Terry Marichaux, now a general practitioner in Grenada, volunteered to be Bishop's bodyguard.
Oh, Bishop was a down-to-earth, charismatic, a person who loved this country, a patriot, somebody who was willing to give his life for his country.
In all of the other areas...
And it wasn't just many Grenadians that were impressed by Bishop's charm. He'd also caught the attention of Cuban President Fidel Castro, who later said the US government despised Grenada and it hated Bishop. Bishop was not an extremist, although yes, he was a true revolutionary, conscientious and honest. Never could we disagree with his intelligent and realistic policies. As well as offering his support to Bishop, Castro was quick to send hundreds of Cuban advisors and technicians to Grenada. Amongst them was Irma Veitia. In her 20s, she was asked to leave her native Havana and go to Grenada as an English language translator.
I was one of the many lucky Cubans who were assigned to different missions in Grenada. So I was a translator for the Cuban personnel at the beginning, and then I was assigned to work as a translator at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the government of Grenada.
The new airport will have a 9,000...
The most high-profile project the Cubans were involved in was the funding and construction of this airport.
But the problem was that they did not have airports prepared to receive big planes and, thousands of tourists a year and that kind of thing. So the Cuban contingent was working in the construction of a new airport, an international airport, to the south of the island. That was at Point Salines.
Cargo planes and for jets.
As work continued, the United States began to worry. President Reagan saw this not as a project to boost tourism. He viewed it as a threat to regional security.
At the southern end of the Caribbean chain, the Cubans, with Soviet financing and backing, are in the process of building an airfield with a 10,000-foot runway. Grenada doesn't even have an air force.
Reagan also justified threatening military action by the fact that there was a medical school with 700 American students right at the end of the runway. Whether it was the threats from Reagan or the pressure of power in Grenada, the political situation began to worsen. An estimated 3,000 opponents of Bishop were at some stage detained without trial. Amongst them was Winston White, a former minister in the pre-revolutionary government. He had known Bishop since childhood.
I had no doubt in my mind at all where he was leading us to.
Which was?
Into the Soviet camp. I had no doubt about that. Castro was just a midway stop. It was on to Moscow we were bound.
White spent over 4 years inside Grenada's notorious Richmond Hill prison. He prayed for outside help.
Well, we, of course, in the dungeons up at Richmond Hill, were praying day and night that President Reagan would, in fact, do something. Let not this be only talk. Because there was no way that there were no signals of us coming out up there.
Complaints about mass torture.
But then there was an unexpected twist to the revolution. Bitter infighting broke out within the ruling party. After a tumultuous few days, Maurice Bishop and several of his ministers were executed here at what was then the Revolutionary Army headquarters. Callistus Bernard led the firing squad which killed Bishop. He served 27 years in prison for his crime and was released in 2009. He had not visited this place since. Bernard does not attempt to justify his actions, but he says that inexperience and international pressure took the revolution he had passionately supported towards a precipice.
What happened with revolution, you have a lot of power concentrated in your hands. You have, you don't have no checks and balances. And anybody needs checks and balances.
Despite being an admirer of Cuba, he is critical of its involvement.
But what happened now in power now, the Cubans in a sense, took sides. Their model is that you had to have a man on top, a maximum leader, right? And everybody else had to follow in line with it. That was their genuine model, because that's the model they have of Fidel. He is the maximum leader, and he wanted to impose that on Grenada.
A nearly defenseless people in a region of great strategic importance to the free world.
Reagan, meanwhile, saw the chaos in Grenada as both an incentive and an opportunity to act.
United States paratroopers have invaded Grenada with helicopter gunships. Our armed forces are engaging them in fierce battle. All Grenadians report immediately to our respective militia bases. All doctors, nurses, and medics report to the hospital immediately.
On the 25th of October, Operation Urgent Fury was launched. Army Ranger Robert Ross, then based in Savannah, Georgia, had no idea where Grenada was when the call came in.
Never heard of the place before. I remember they called us in on alert on a Sunday morning. And when I got there, they said, okay, this is the real deal. We're going into Grenada. I was like, what?
In one sign of a lack of preparedness, the American invaders had no military charts of the island. They adapted tourist maps.
This is the point where we had a fighting position set up here, and there was guys across the street, the runway here, firing at us. And the only way to get across the runway, we found a bulldozer. We straight wired the bulldozer, and we put Sergeant Bowles on it. Everybody got behind the bulldozer and fought across the runway up the hill to take on the enemy.
So who was the enemy? Were you fighting Grenadians or Cubans?
Both. We was fighting Grenadians and Cubans. A lot of the people that was part of the resistance.
Irma Vatia watched it all unfold.
Well, we Cubans had a meeting the day before the invasion. It was, there was no doubt that the Americans would come and, invade the island. And when we went out, we were able to see that the helicopters were already dropping the parachuters, and they were occupying the area where the Cuban workers were building the runway of the future, or what could be the airport. We responded to the attack, but we had no means to really fight against that invasion. We needed weapons, powerful weapons, They had ships, the helicopters, the 82nd Airborne Division, So there were a handful of Cubans with a few rifles.
This complex looked like a large storage and
the American military says it did face heavily armed resistance, and during the invasion discovered a large hoard of weapons.
Over this hill, we found a warehouse that contained over 110,000 weapons, which the island, as I remember, had a population of 110,000 people. There was enough weapons that was found that could give every man, woman, and child a weapon.
The invasion was condemned with a large majority by the UN General Assembly as a flagrant violation of international law. And British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was apparently furious that her close ally Ronald Reagan had not warned her of his plan to invade a country which was still a member of the British Commonwealth. The President had to make an excruciatingly difficult phone call.
Hello, Margaret Thatcher, yes?
If I were there, Margaret, I'd throw my hat in the door before I came in. Listen, we regret very much the embarrassment that's been caused you, and I'd just like to tell you what the story is from our end out here.
I was awakened at 3 o'clock in the morning, supposedly on a golfing vacation down in Georgia, and was there with the Secretary of State, and so we met in pajamas out in the living room of our suite to, because of this this urgent plea from the Organization of East Caribbean States, pleading with us to support them in this thing in Grenada. When your word came with your concerns, by the time I got it, the 0 hour had passed and our forces were on their way.
45 Grenadians, 25 Cubans and 19 Americans were killed during the US intervention. At a speech honoring the Cubans that died, Fidel Castro criticized the coup that had ousted Bishop, but said the decision to try to help Grenada repel the US invasion was the right one. Cuba, he said, was placed in a morally complex and difficult situation. Under these conditions, he explained, we under no circumstances could abandon the country. If imperialism really intended to attack Grenada, our duty was to remain there. To withdraw at that moment would have been dishonourable and could even have stimulated the aggression, now in Grenada and tomorrow in Cuba. Winston White, meanwhile, was in prison when he heard the commotion surrounding the US invasion. How did he react?
Gleefully, because then you knew what liberation time had come.
But what about people who say that this is an act of the big imperialist kind of taking over the island?
Nonsense, nonsense, nonsense. No, absolute nonsense. I mean, they should have been inside there, then they would have been happy that the big imperialist came.
In a nearby cell was Tillman Thomas, who would later become Prime Minister of Grenada.
I mean, the Prime Minister was executed, several ministers were executed, the whole nation, island was under house arrest. You know, people couldn't come out to get basic necessities for a few days. I mean, so there was need for some form of intervention to restore democratic rights and to restore institutions. It was like anarchy.
Like all the other Cubans on the island, Irma was rounded up by the American soldiers.
Well, after 1 week at what they call the concentration camp in Point Salines, we returned to Cuba. First of all, they line up all the personnel, all the women first, and then the rest of the personnel. And they said, on the march, and we walked and walked and walked. We didn't know where they were taking us. And finally, we stopped at a certain point, after an hour walking around the island, we stopped at a certain point, and they told us that we had to wait there. Then the International Red Cross came with some transportation, and they took us to the old airport in Grenada, and there we boarded a plane that brought us back to Cuba.
41 years after the invasion, few physical reminders remain, and most of the scars of that divisive time have also healed.
Grenada, island of spice.
In 2009, the airport was officially named after Maurice Bishop. Tillman Thomas, Prime Minister at the time, approved of the idea, even though he had been imprisoned by Bishop.
That project is really a project that people identify with the revolution. And if you have to name that after somebody, we feel that Bishop was the appropriate person.
Ironic, but I let it go because Fidel Castro really made a great contribution to the building of the airport.
Callistus Bernard, who admits being involved in the killing of Bishop and spent 5 years on death row, has done most to believe in forgiveness.
We survived, right? And it's our obligation now to really, do as much as we could to really promote healing and reconciliation, because These were terrible events. These were terrible times.
Fatia, meanwhile, who in 1983 left Grenada in handcuffs, recently returned.
To my surprise, to my delight, I found a different Grenada. You know, the country has developed a lot. Tourism is the main industry at the moment. Some of those people who studied here in Cuba many years ago are now in leading positions in different sectors of the government and the country as such.
There are some who suggest that while the US might have won the battle here, they didn't necessarily win the war. Maurice Bishop's former bodyguard points out that despite being expelled, the Cubans soon returned.
They still came back and built a hospital for us. They still sent many of their professionals to work in our hospitals and to work in all different fields in Grenada. And they're still very welcome in Grenada because people see them as you know, genuine friends of the Grenadian people who are always willing and ready to help. You compare that to the United States, which was the invading forces. But what have they done for Grenada in 30 years? Literally nothing. There's nothing that you can point to as a monument that says, this is something that Americans built for us after the invasion that we can uphold as part of that love and cooperation between the United States and Grenada. In fact, the Chinese have come in and have done more than the United States. We have a brand new stadium that they built for us.
But plenty of others are grateful for the US invasion, which they see as preventing this small island from taking a path to disaster.
Our thanks to Stephen Gibbs for that report. For Cuba, this episode was a turning point in its foreign policies. Doctors and nurses sent to help countries in need is one of Cuba's soft diplomacy efforts.
Coming up.
Remembering the man who made Cuba a model for other countries.
Fidel was known for his commitment to solidarity, his commitment to revolution, and that made him a hero among many in Latin America.
America's Now.
Welcome back. Warrior, rebel, commander, survivor. Fidel Castro led a revolution that reshaped Cuba and made it the first communist country in the Western Hemisphere. His rule spanned the administrations of 10 U.S. presidents, and his life became a symbol of defiance to the United States. Castro encouraged socialist movements across Latin America and made an important impact in the region in other ways. Joining me now to discuss Fidel Castro's influence on Latin America is Peter Kornblue, director of the National Security Archives Chile Documentation Project and of the Cuba Documentation Project. Welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
You have met Fidel Castro, conversed with him, spent time with him. What was he really like as a person?
Well, it's hard to know him deeply personally, of course. I met him in a professional capacity. We had a number of private lunches and a couple of state dinners around two conferences that I helped organize with his office. One was on the 40th anniversary of the famous, and some would say infamous, Bay of Pigs invasion led by the Central Intelligence Agency, and the other was on the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which of course was the moment in our recent history when the world came closest to nuclear Armageddon. And we were able to bring extraordinary historical actors from both of those episodes from the Cold War to Cuba to sit down with Fidel Castro. He graciously received even retired CIA officials who had once tried to assassinate him. And one of my most extraordinary moments was having the deputy director of the CIA's Bay of Pigs operation sitting in a conference room at the Palace of Conferences in Havana, across the conference room table from Fidel Castro, and saying, you know, Fidel, when you were in the mountains leading the insurrection, I was on a CIA Caribbean task force monitoring your movements, and I want to let you know that we were all Fidelistas at that moment. We thought you were a romantic figure. The CIA initially thought that Fidel would be the spiritual leader of democratic forces in Latin America, which shows you the quality of their intelligence at the time. But he graciously received former members of the Kennedy family, CIA officials, Robert McNamara, who had been Secretary of Defense during the Kennedy administration, and so many others. He was a historical figure. He carried a lot of history right up in his extraordinary mind. And now that history is somewhat gone to the grave with him until the Cuban government decides to declassify many of his personal papers so that those of us, the students of his history, can continue to learn more about what he did. And
Talk about his role in Latin America, because he inspired this sort of generation of leaders across the region, and they certainly had a different interpretation of what he stood for than in other places in the world.
You know, Fidel Castro played the role of David versus Goliath when it came to the imperial United States of America. It's hard to really describe how the United States had controlled Cuba in the first half of the 20th century. I mean, Cuba basically became a playground for the rich and famous of the United States, and a mafia stronghold and a corporate stronghold. All the major U.S. agricultural and communications corporations controlled all of Cuba's economy. The U.S. Congress came within a couple of votes of annexing Cuba as another state of the United States of America in the 1800s. That's how presumptuous the United States of America was when it came to Cuba. And of course, we occupied Cuba at the turn of the 20th century after the Spanish-American Civil War, rewrote the Cuban Constitution, etc. So Fidel really stood up to the United States, and that was part of the nationalism that was generated by the U.S. kind of hegemonic pressures on Cuba, really inspired him. And when he was able to not only overthrow Batista, but then tell the United States to take a hike, you know, the revolution meant that Cuba was going to have an independent government and an independent foreign policy. That certainly started off this Cold War confrontation. But in the eyes of so many others in Latin America, a region that kind of in a larger sense has also struggled under the hegemon of U.S. influence and economic control for so many decades, particularly in the 1800s and the 20th century, somewhat less in the 21st century. In the eyes of so many Latin Americans, Fidel was a revolutionary model. He was the classic revolutionary. He defeated a CIA-led invasion. He kicked out the major corporations, the agricultural corporations, United Fruit, the oil corporations. He said Cuba's going to be a small country, but a proud and independent country. And that inspired quite a few people in Latin America and created quite a few problems for a lot of governments. And Fidel was known for his commitment to solidarity, his commitment to revolution, and that made him a hero among many in Latin America.
Do you think he was misunderstood then by a lot of other people around the world? Because some, people take issue with other things he's done.
Well, revolution isn't a positive thing for a lot of people who stand to lose when a revolution takes place. The United States didn't want to see leftist revolutions in Latin America. The phrase, not another Cuba, became very prevalent in internal memoranda and the national security bureaucracy of the United States of America. No more Cubas, no more Cubas. I remember a time when it was no more Chinas. But after the Cuban Revolution, it became no more Cubas in the Western Hemisphere. So I don't know that Fidel was misunderstood. I mean, if you lost out, if you were imprisoned by Fidel, if you organized against Fidel and were caught, obviously he could be extremely repressive. And the things that are said about his human rights abuses and his abuse of power are largely true. He took the position that Cuba was threatened by the United States of America, and that you had to have a very tight national security defense, and that included keeping those people who might be agents of the United States, and he called every dissident an agent whether they were or not, from gaining a stronghold in the society. And so he was very repressive, and Cuba was a very tightly controlled state under his rule, and to a degree still is today.
Cuba is really known for its health care and its medical diplomacy, sending its doctors and nurses around the region to help those in need who are experiencing the aftermath of natural disasters. Talk about some of the positive things that Cuba is known for and that Fidel started.
You know, Fidel attached tremendous importance on universal education and universal health care. And he really elevated Cuba, particularly in the late 60s and 70s, to be very high in the world indices on infant mortality rates, on health for toddlers, and on access to education. He attached a great emphasis on the fact that anybody who had the know-how up here could go to medical school. And he opened the doors to Cuban medical schools, not only to tens of thousands of Cubans who would otherwise never have had an opportunity to go to this kind of school, but also to Latin Americans and other members of the Third World. He gave scholarships to Guyanese students where there was not a single medical training facility in the entire country to come to Cuba in the 1970s and study medicine and then go back to their country as doctors. He created a medical brigade, an international medical brigade, kind of Cuba's version of Doctors Without Borders, and sent them around the world. He sent them to Haiti. He sent them to Africa. Raul has just sent them to fight the Ebola virus, for example, but Fidel was sending them to countries even before Raul took over. And these programs also gained Cuba tremendous status. I was in Cuba with a friend from Peru just this last May, and we went to eat at this organic farm, and there was a guy cooking there for us. And he said, "Oh, I was in Peru. I was there with a medical brigade. I was the cook for a medical brigade that went to do free eye surgery for Peruvian peasants in the hinterlands that didn't have access to surgery, had cataracts, but if with proper care could actually have their sight restored." And this is the type of program that gained Cuba, a small Caribbean country, that one never would have expected to gain this type of international status, the prestige that it had under Castro's leadership.
Peter, what does the future of Cuba look like without Fidel Castro? And the future of the region? Is this the end of an era?
Well, it certainly is an end of an era. In some ways, it's the end of the 20th century. In some ways, it's the end of the Cold War of sorts, particularly when it relates to Latin America. It's not the end of the controversy inside Cuba about Fidel's legacy there on the economy, on the society. It's not the end of the Cuban Communist Party, which continues to be deeply entrenched as the institutional leadership of that country. It's not the end, I don't think, now with Donald Trump coming in, of the U.S.-Cuban conflict. We may well see a return of the efforts of the United States of America to push Cuba around, and that's a frightening thought, frankly, and certainly a regressive process, unfortunately. But Fidel kind of will leave an international legacy for Cuba that Cuba will continue to try and meet, of playing an important role in the world, a role that is far larger than its actual geographic size. And I think that's the legacy that a lot of people will remember him for.
Peter Kornblue, thank you so much for joining us on America's Now.
Thank you for having me on to talk about this historical issue.
Coming up.
Cubans react to the death of a revolutionary.
I was shaken and I felt sad. Fidel was a man that entered into every Cuban's life and was part of this country.
America's Now.
Welcome back to this special edition of America's Now. Fidel Castro governed Cuba for almost 5 decades. He was the country's prime minister and president between 1959 and 2006, and officially resigned from his duties in 2000. His reign lasted longer than any of Latin America's other military leaders, and for many Cubans, Fidel Castro was the only president they knew, an ever-present authority figure who was in power since their birth. America's Now sent producer and cinematographer Armando Guerra to talk to some of those Cubans and get their reaction to the revolutionary's death.
Los primeros recuerdos, de los primeros, la entrada de Fidel en La Habana, lo recuerdo montado en un tanque.
Los primeros recuerdos que tengo de él, de cuando yo era pequeña, que triunfó la revolución. Hubo la campaña de alfabetización, cuando se le dieron las tierras a los campesinos.
Los primeros recuerdos que yo tengo de Fidel es Fidel dando discursos. Siempre está dando discursos, salía mucho en la televisión cuando yo era niño. Igual todos los 26 de julio daba un discurso y yo los veía todos, me encantaba verlo. Toda Cuba vivía enamorada de Fidel. Y yo también.
Me sentí muy conmovido, me sentí golpeado y me sentí triste. Fidel es un hombre que se ha colado en la vida del país completamente y era parte de la vida del país.
Todo el mundo sintió mucha tristeza. Incluso fíjese que se puede observar que en ninguna casa aquí se ha puesto música y todo el mundo está en silencio, con un respeto y una solemnidad. Yo creo que los mayores logros que él ha tenido ha sido la educación y la medicina, que la cual la ha llevado no solo a Cuba, sino a otras partes del mundo.
De darnos la libertad, de hacer que Cuba fuera una Cuba libre y soberana, de quitarnos el yugo del imperialismo, que por muchos años Cuba tuvo sometida primero al colonialismo español y después al neocolonialismo americano.
Su mayor fracaso es en la economía, principalmente. Oficialmente se reconoce que la economía es la principal asignatura pendiente de la revolución, como si eso fuera un detalle menor. Eso es la cosa más importante que tiene que lograr el socialismo.
Han habido muchos problemas que incluso no se puede asumir una única verdad por muchos años porque el mundo va cambiando.
O de lograr las cosas que sí logró, no permitió tantas libertades como debía haber permitido. Libertades de opinión, de contradecirlo.
Yo soy religiosa, yo soy evangélica y siempre estuvimos orando por él para que él entendiera nuestro punto de vista y con el tiempo él lo entendió. Y entonces dio libertad de culto que antes no la teníamos.
El futuro necesita de renovación, continuación, sin perder los conceptos que tenemos de revolución y los conceptos de las políticas básicas, pero hay mucho que hacer y hay mucho que modernizar.
Todo el mundo sintió mucha tristeza, con un respeto y una solemnidad a la pérdida tan importante que ha tenido el país.
Oí muchas exclamaciones de viva Fidel, aplausos al pasar, y yo estuve contagiado de eso y puedo confesarte que me sentí estremecido en ese momento y las lágrimas se me saltaron.
In April, Fidel Castro warned Cubans that his death was not far off. He also appealed to members of his party to continue to uphold his vision for a communist Cuba.
Coming up.
A ballerina whose life was turned around by Castro.
When we performed for him, he told me he felt proud and happy.
It was one of the biggest moments of my life.
Que me va a pasar a mí en mi vida.
America's Now.
Welcome back to America's Now. Former Royal Ballet superstar Carlos Acosta formed a new company called Acosta Dance. One of its dancers, Marta Ortega, shows us her typical day in Havana and the people and places that inspire her. Marta is this week's Urban Voice.
Me llamo Marta Ortega Cuevas, soy bailarina. Nací en una calle, poca gente conoce aquí en La Habana, que se llama Peña Pobre. Es una calle que tiene solo 3 cuadras, en La Habana Vieja. Nací ahí, me crié ahí y he vivido los 28 años de vivir en el mismo lugar. Desde mi casa se ve todo lo que es el morro y es una de las imágenes más lindas que yo he tenido en toda mi vida. Cuando estoy de gira por el mundo entero, una de las cosas que más yo extraño es ver esa pared, por cómo le da el sol en la mañana, como le da el sol en la tarde, el sonido de los barcos cuando entran o cuando salen. Nosotros los bailarines somos como los portavoces de cierta forma de todo. Sentarse a ver un espectáculo de ballet bien hecho es muy gratificante, pero sentarse a ver una obra donde los bailarines sufren, lloran, ríen, gozan y te dan un mensaje es mucho más gratificante todavía. Y si yo como intérprete puedo hacer que la persona se vaya a su casa con una idea a reflexionar, para mí mi trabajo vale la pena. Es lo mejor que puedo aportarle, ¿no? al mundo. Incluso a mi propio país. Las veces que he trabajado en procesos creativos como ensayadora y como intérprete también, me gusta que la gente sea lo más sincera con ellos posible. A la vez que el artista, en este caso el bailarín, es sincero con uno mismo, la gente recibe esa energía y recibe tu sinceridad. Y la gente vive a través de lo que tú estás tratando de transmitirle. De montar coreografías y cosas viene desde que yo estoy bien chiquitita. Entonces, esa coreografía ganó premio en el concurso coreográfico, ganó el primer premio. Y un día estamos y la maestra, la directora, dice: mira, no se pueden ir, que estamos esperando a alguien muy importante, no se pueden ir. Y de repente empezamos a ver gente con traje, gente y mucho movimiento, y no sé quién será el importante que viene. ¿Quién será? ¿Quién será? Era Fidel Castro. Y de repente dice: ¿quién es la responsable de la coreografía esa que está en todas las tribunas abiertas? A mí me encanta. Y era yo, la más chiquitica del grupo. Habló conmigo, me preguntó en qué me había inspirado, por supuesto, que estaba muy orgulloso, muy contento. Le hicimos la coreografía y eso fue una de las experiencias más grandes que me ha pasado a mí en mi vida. hace un tiempo estoy pensando quizás en crear algo para mí que tenga que ver un poco con mi vida, preferentemente que hable mucho acerca de mis padres. Es como un regalo que les quiero hacer. Mi casa es una fiesta todo el tiempo. Mi padre hace muchos chistes, mi madre no habla nunca, pero cuando habla es una fiesta. Esa pieza que quiero hacer, quiero que sea como mucho más íntima, mucho más, así bien, un poco más pausada, más tranquila. La imagen de una persona sentada en una silla tiene mucho significado. O es, me senté y me rendí, o es, a partir de ahora me voy a levantar y voy a empezar a caminar.
Cuba is home to some of the world's most famous dancers. On the top of the list is legendary ballerina Alicia Alonso. She danced for the American Ballet Theater and eventually became the first Western dancer invited to perform in the Soviet Union. At the age of 95, she is the director of the famous National Ballet of Cuba and still joins the company while touring abroad.
America's Now.
Finally, a few things you may not know about Fidel Castro. He was an avid reader, had journalistic aspirations, and was the author and co-author of several books. In fact, one of his close friendships was with the late Nobel Prize-winning author Gabriel Garcia Marquez. We leave you with some classic quotes from Fidel Castro. Thanks for watching this special edition of America's Now. We look forward to seeing you again next week.
Patria o muerte, venceremos. Y nosotros no hemos renunciado a ese derecho.